So to just get this talk started off, so Coriolanus, the play that we're going to be discussing, is Shakespeare's last tragedy, and right before he wrote Antony and Cleopatra, and a lot of it was what concerns is about basically the dangers of democracy, and the threats that Shakespeare saw in his time of demagogues that he saw in late England, and then compared them to the Roman Republic. So my question to you first is, what makes this so timeless for us when we're looking at our current moment and we're looking around and seeing that this play has been updated now in the summer of 2018? What makes Shakespeare's words and plays so timeless? What are the sentiments that we see in communications, in how people communicate, that are constant throughout all of these?
Right. So the opening caveat is, I'm not a Shakespeare expert, but I do stuff related to public policy. And what makes it timeless is Shakespeare hones in on human emotion, probably better than anybody who's ever written. And he, in this play, focuses on democracy, whose Achilles heel has always been that it's rooted in the emotions of voters, which are mutable and shallow in some cases. So for democracy to work, you're dependent on the best of human nature, and yet humans are prey to the worst of human nature, and philosophers forever have always thought about what are the fallibilities of democracy, are there checks that you can put on it, and this is always going to be a question related to governance, which is to what extent are we willing to trust the vicissitudes of the people? We know the good part. It's a check on autocracy and all the things. It's the Winston Churchill line. It's better than all the other systems. But what he is putting his finger on is it's got its inherent flaws and always will, because the masses are prone to human emotion. And that's, I think, at the heart of the play.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that the masses are always prone to the vicissitudes of human emotion, demagogic appeals and whatnot. Given that the mediums that which the masses have been affected by this have changed so much over time, like when we're talking about Coriolanus' time, it was just speeches in the street by generals, like Shakespeare had pamphlets and whatnot. When you look at the American Revolution, we saw Thomas Paine and the Federalist Papers traveling around, and now we've got like screens in our pockets all the time that tell us like every other thing that every politician wants us to have. So how has the mediums that have changed affected how people...
Yeah, so I just urge you to think about the historical journey. And we did this when we first got together. So you can go back to Roman times where we're giving speeches to predominantly illiterate folks, so you've got to move them with your words. You fast forward, in my mind, to say revolutionary times where, the Federalist Papers are people writing in the hopes of persuading the voters of that time to support the Constitution, what have you. But if you recall, you also have some really nasty newspapers, people writing anonymously and using the written word and owning and operating a newspaper to get your political views across, whether it's Ben Franklin or any of the other participants at that time. Again, the written word, veiled in anonymity, is the tool of choice. If you fast forward further, you've got the advent of radio, and I think one thing to note is each of these things brings pluses and minuses. The technologies are just the technologies. It's kind of what you write onto them. So radio clearly is the tool that allows Roosevelt to speak to the masses and arguably wards off whatever might have happened in the depths of the Great Depression, rallies the country for World War II. He's a master. I mean, Roosevelt's clearly the first or the most prominent master of that medium. But of course, that's also the medium that Father Coughlin uses to rally all of his hate and venom and everything else. So let us not forget that back then, it introduced a more nefarious actor and actors. Then you, of course, have television. And most of you are probably familiar with the fact that you have the Nixon-Kennedy debate, and that the people who were listening to that thought that Nixon won, and those who watched thought that Kennedy won. And of course, now this has made politics even more superficial and everything, so all of the attendant challenges that come with TV, and of course, that is connected. We'll get to the 24-hour news cycle and cables and television, but then arguably you have Obama, who is the first to use email, I mean, social media, but not nearly the tools that we're seeing other people use. But he was the first one to capture cell phone numbers and to connect with people by text and so on. And then obviously you have President Trump using Twitter for the first time. So there's clearly an arc of different ways of communicating with people over time, and we can come back to the pluses and minuses, but each one of them is really just a neutral tool that is then used for whatever purposes leaders want to put it to.
Interesting. One of the things that I definitely remember from my high school Shakespeare classes is how when you actually translate some of Shakespeare's prose, it comes out as quite crass and sometimes what you find just as an internet meme today. So I like the timelessness of some of the content, even though.
Yeah, I mean, it's really cool. And we also haven't seen Coriolanus. We've just read about it and seen excerpts that you can take the language and have people texting it, but using the original language. I mean, that speaks to the timelessness of the language and the message, that you can set it in different places, different times. And I think that's one of the remarkable things about the underlying language.
No, definitely. Okay, shifting gears for a moment. So you and I are both Dartmouth alumni and/or soon-to-be Dartmouth alumni, and also you were the Economist's correspondent here in the United States, and we've both been editors and correspondents for different news for our respective papers. So I'm a bit curious to hear, in the bit of the shorter view of media and a bit of a shorter view of how people have communicated, what have you seen as the big changes in newspaper and the media industry over the past few decades? What's been the shifting in how Americans have just communicated with each other in your time in the industry?
The big difference is just the pace at which it all happened. So, part of my prerogative since I've got the microphone is just to tell old guy stories. My first serious job as a journalist was for a newspaper here on campus. We still did the old kind of lay it out by hand. You put the columns, you glue them on. We had to raise a lot of money to buy a laser printer, which was like a huge, the one that comes free with a Happy Meal now. It used to cost thousands of dollars. That was our big. And then we would drive down to the Claremont Eagle with a hard deadline, because if they weren't running it by a certain time, it would interfere with their own printing. What that means from a practical standpoint is that news could be digested. You kind of delivered it with a thump on people's doorstep. They had time to read. The next news would come the next day. And we would like to think that, by having that deadline, you kind of thought about the story, you filed the story, there was some closure to it, and then you did it again. That slowly gave way to the kind of, there's always a story. When I was with The Economist, we were still on weekly deadlines with no compulsion to file periodically in between. There's no internet presence and so on. So the plus side of what's happened is it's instantaneous. If you want to find out what's happening right now, we'll know. You can go to the New York Times, and they'll tell you exactly what's happening. I would argue the downside is it's less filtered, less digested, more just kind of shooting out at you. And the tension there is between the instantaneous nature of the news and this kind of taking a chance to step back and absorb it in a more methodical and deliberate way.
No, of course. When you bring up the just constant stream of news coming at us, that makes me think of push notifications on our phones and whatnot, and how, if you do not change the setting in your iPhone, you will be getting likely BuzzFeed and New York Times and the Wall Street Journal just coming at you. Which then also brings up for me another question where, so one of the things that happened in this new environment is that we get it more constantly and that we have so much more access to what's going on around the world. And that's democratized media and made media a lot more global and more aware. But I'm more likely to get a push notification from the New York Times or The Economist or the BBC about something happening in Europe than I am to get a push notification from the Valley News about what's happening here. So if you could speak a bit about just kind of is this democratization of media, or is this a balkanization? Which one are we? Probably
balkanization. I mean, one thing, since most of you have lived through this whole cycle, one thing to remind you of is that when it first started, so when you first have the internet delivering news and cutting out the middleman, and I use middleman quite deliberately, the first thought was great. I mean, it was a very optimistic time, in part because our news was homogenized. It was, coming through the 3 television channels a handful of newspapers, and wow, we're finally going to be liberated from those people who are kind of putting their own spin on the news, who are, kind of not listening to the voices that are underrepresented. I mean, most people thought that this was a very optimistic thing, that you could get lots and lots of information without these gatekeepers. Now, you fast forward, it turns out we're a little nostalgic for some gatekeepers. So in terms of your question about the Valley News and the New York Times, I think, one concerning thing is that although anybody theoretically can get their message out, it actually requires deep pockets to invest in the technology, their network effects, where if you're reaching lots and lots of people, you've got more sway with advertisers and so on. So there are two potentially pernicious things. One is all this democratization of news has come with some costs. I would like some filters. And second is it may not even be as democratizing as we had hoped, in that it's still hard to get your message out if you're not a mainstream group.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, awesome. So that brings up for me the notion that how to get your message out, especially in like this new social media environment that we have, is usually to appeal to something that I think that even Shakespeare back in his day knew, which is just that like outrage and what's the most sensational and maybe not necessarily the most accurate information is what's going to travel the fastest. A lot of like what the play is about how people like lead with their hearts and not their minds, and that's really what's like governing the politics of the plebeians, which, yeah. So if you could talk for a minute about just kind of why these like demagogic appeals like travel so much through social media, what's new about that, what in the new trend of like fake news is actually all that new, and what is just like
fake news isn't terribly new in that propaganda has been with us for a long time. It's taken new forms, and we can and should come back to that. So not only are you trying to get your message out, a lot of this stuff is about trying to get people to act in a certain way. So, the point of propaganda is just like not to read something and say, wow, that guy's a kook, and then go back to what you're doing. It's, I want you to vote against that person. I want you to give money to this cause. And I think what Shakespeare intuited is emotion is the guide to that. It's interesting how Shakespeare's writing hundreds of years ago, and social science is only now catching up to what most of his plays, or the ones that I'm familiar with, tell us. So Jonathan Haidt, who's a social psychologist down at NYU, has said, the human being is a small jockey sitting atop an elephant, and the elephant is emotion, and the small jockey trying to guide that is rational thought. If you're trying to reach people and get them to do something, by and large, you're trying to get to that emotion. You're trying to get the elephant to go somewhere. And oftentimes the elephant goes somewhere and we rationalize ex post. Well, I'm doing this because I've thought through the position paper and it makes sense. Well,
motivated
when in fact, someone has gone to you with your emotion. So how do you reach people via emotion? Well, it turns out that fear is a more powerful, not just, I'm saying like in the brain, fear will motivate you to act more than hope or aspiration or some of the other more positive attributes. So when you turn on the TV and you hear these horrible television political commercials, Matt Brown will take your Medicare away, all of it.
Big Tea Party conservative.
Right. These are not beautiful ads. You don't look at them and say, wow, the artistry of that, but they work. And this is part of the problem, is that if you, and it's also true of, money is so important in political campaigns. Well, how do you get money? You don't run it, sending out a push notification or email that says, Matt Brown is a very sensible guy who will compromise in order to, come up with a budget solution that will raise your taxes, but not too much, right? No, it's like he will never raise your taxes, he promises. So if you want to mobilize people, raise money, incite action, it behooves you to come up with a more extreme message. And now, to go back to where we started, there are more mediums through which you can reach people and target people. So the other thing, we've been talking about and thinking about, Twitter and email and, all the mechanisms, but there's something else that's been going on kind of in the back office, which is we're getting way better at slicing and dicing the data. Right? This is a thing, Obama's probably the first to really make very good use of what we know about all of you, right? So if actually, I've gotten the voter records on some of you. That was my talk last week. But we know a lot about how you vote, what you buy, and so on. I mean, that's the big data piece of it. So when you marry the big data piece to the fact that I can now reach you in a certain way via your Facebook profile or whatever else you've signed up for, that's a very potent combination. It's really the different ways of reaching you married to what we know about you and your friends, increasingly. So for example, here's a positive way, and again, we don't want to be too down on this. So there was actually, Harvard Business School did a forum on kind of political entrepreneurs, so people who are doing all kinds of things to arguably transform the political realm for the better. And one of them was it was an entrepreneur to increase African American turnout. And the way they did it was by getting people to text other people in their networks. That we know that the most effective message is if you get a text from a friend, and it didn't actually say, the whole MO was not to say, vote for X. It was, hey, I just voted, have you? And that was it. But, once you tap into people's networks, you can reach a lot of people that way. So, I mean, that, I would argue, is using technology for the good. But it's all quite sophisticated. And it's all quite compartmentalized in that you're increasingly reaching smaller and smaller segments as opposed to the New York Times, which drops on the thump, and it's really the same paper for everybody who's getting it back in the day.
No, definitely. I think that it's interesting that in America, at least, and actually around the world, we're starting to see a lot more of this, like, populist energy and the balkanization of media, when in times past you didn't necessarily need to have, like, WhatsApp and GroupMe and whatnot to, like, be in this level. So do you think that the moment that we're in is actually all that influenced by the technology that we have now, or do you think that it's just history rhymes?
The technology definitely matters. Like, it definitely amplifies the message for the good. I mean, how many of you remember the optimism around the Arab Spring, which was, you have the guy in, Tunisia, right? And then that's broadcast immediately through social media and spreads, that was perceived to be, it kind of didn't turn out as well as we'd hope, but this is social media reaching people in a way, particularly in countries where traditional forms of media have been controlled by governments. It kind of transcends that. It's also true with hate groups. So, if you read about the white supremacy groups and so on, the people who are trying to fight against that will tell you it was really easy back in the day. They actually had a newspaper, and it had, it couldn't reach that many people, and the groups monitoring would, Southern Poverty Law. Would subscribe as well, and you kind of follow what's going on, and it's, and that is clearly amplified by social media because it allows people in deep, dark corners of human nature to find each other, and so on. So I do believe that the basic impulses have always been there, right? That's the Shakespeare part, right? So there's always been the basic human emotions, but we can tap into them in ways and amplify them in ways that we could not before, and that's clearly the social media piece.
No, definitely. And with that, the pace at which that these platforms and the mediums by which people can have to communicate and has just changed so much even over just the past decade. Like, I talk with my sister a lot, who just is a freshman in college now. She'd be a 22 if she went here, about the just fact that, like, she doesn't have a Facebook and is like, oh no, I only communicate through Snapchat, GroupMe, Twitter, like much more compartmentalized platforms, and how even then, like, when you talk with people much younger than her, they're like, oh no, like, I have my own networks that make me feel old. So when it comes to these platforms and, like, the evolution of them, there's so much changing in them so quickly. It's important, it's innovative, but how do we, when we talk about the need for new filters or the need for really understanding how information is getting disseminated on these, like, what obligation do these platforms have?
So this is a really hard policy question. So, but let's back up. Like, the one thing that hasn't changed is this is just all about people wanting to connect with one another, right? So, I'll tell you another old guy story. So I remember when I first came to Dartmouth, there was some event, and there were some students and some alums, and a student came up and he said, I understand that you're a Dartmouth alum. I said, I am. And he said, I told him when I'd graduated, it was a long time ago, and he said, I have a question for you. if you were having a party and you wanted people to come, how did you tell them you were having a party? And it was an earnest, quite the earnestness was just, and he's just like, and I said, well, first we made flyers, like photocopied and put them up, and then everyone had a whiteboard on their door, and you'd write on people's whiteboards, and then most people studied in the same place day after day because you knew that you could find them. That was part of what went on, and you kind of do all those things. And he just looks at me and goes, that is so cool. Only if I'd been ridden a horse, I think would it have been. But that's just group me,
right.
Only without the technology. So that part hasn't changed at all. I think the part that's changed in a very dangerous way, two things actually. One is the merging of entertainment and news. And again, this is one we thought was great. Back in the day, any sensible person would say, I'm slightly uncomfortable that all our news is filtered by just a handful of news organizations with their own points of view, and it's pretty homogenized. And wow, once we take the lid off that and allow different, it's all going to be good. What we didn't anticipate, those were, if not loss leaders, CBS and NBC, they're not making money on news. Well, the marriage of cable TV, you all know this, but the entertainment aspect, which is, okay, now this is no longer, however flawed those three newscasts may have been, they were at least trying to provide news in a modestly objective way, knowing that they had their own biases and everything else. When you fast forward to an era when, okay, what we really want to do is make a lot of money on this news program, and you and I are just going to yell at each other and say outlandish things because then people will tune in, that's a really unfortunate development when we no longer feel an obligation, however imperfect, to deliver news. And this is just about getting viewers with the guys that were actually doing news. And Robert Reich, class of '68, tells a very funny story, sad, about being on a news program trying to promulgate some view and giving a fairly rational, rational view for something. And the producer comes on during the break and says, yeah, you're going to need to be a little louder. Can you argue some more? And he says, no, I'm going to just talk about this. And they do another segment. The producer comes on. You got to really amp it up. We need to have you yelling. It's got to be a little discomfort here. And he, as in his own telling, says, look, the only yelling is going to be at you if you don't get over this. But his point, I think, is really an important one, which is this is about the yelling. And so I think that's been an unfortunate development. Then the other one, which you allude to in the question, is, okay, now that it's become kind of an echo chamber. Well, there are two separate issues. One is it's an echo chamber. You kind of turn on your news or your Facebook group or whatever it is, and you just, your own genius is repeated back to you, which isn't so great. And then and that isn't so great even if it's accurate. And then the whole, okay, what if it's not accurate? There's no one's even attempting to filter this, and that's the Facebook, Twitter problem. And I don't know. We've got really competing principles here, which is this is not, it's not necessarily a First Amendment issue. So you could, in fact, and Facebook and Twitter are, in fact, trying to restrain some of the content. But it bumps up very quickly against our appreciation for free expression. And certainly I'm old enough to have come out of the Cold War era where, restraining content, by and large, has been a really negative thing. So these competing impulses, one is we would like things not to be wildly misleading and hateful, versus kind of we're really uncomfortable with any central authority, even if it's a private sector firm, and maybe especially if it's a private sector firm, kind of determining what content is acceptable. That could go really bad really fast.
No, that brings up for me, thinking about now, so we're talking about the blending of entertainment and media and journalism, and that is in itself just a huge issue that I don't know that if we're ever going to untangle them now. But when you're talking about media bubbles and speaking to the hyper-partisan era that we're in right now, that makes me think about how when we think about the context that the First Amendment was written in, Common Sense was not a nonpartisan paper and everyone was reading it. The Federalist Papers were not nonpartisan issues, but And that was in a much, much different medium than what we have now. But then looking when The View from Nowhere came in, and either it was that if they weren't partisan, Walter Cronkite was speaking to you and E.G. Dionne was in your opinion section, and that's just what you had then. But now we've got BuzzFeed and Vox and Breitbart and is this partisan era okay if we may or may not have been here before? What's different about this
point out, back in the day they were just as nasty and often untruthful and ad hominem, and it was not like they were communicating in iambic pentameter in colonial times. It was bad. I think there are a couple things that are different. One of the most alarming things, I think, is just the deterioration of the intellectual honesty. So partisanship doesn't actually, so ideological fervor doesn't bother me so much, in that if you're a true believer and you want to sit up here and tell me about your beliefs and they're a little wacky, then we can at least have a conversation, because if there's overlap or a commitment to understanding it, we can probably make some progress. But if your beliefs are motivated by the fact that it gets a lot of people to tune in, then we're not actually trying to get to a better place. We're not trying to figure out what the Constitution should look like or what's the fastest way to civil rights or what have you. We're not trying to solve a problem. You're just making noise for the sake of making noise. And it could be nostalgia on my part, but I don't know that past eras where the message was just as ideological, the fervor was just as pitched, but I don't know that we had the same degree of intellectual dishonesty. And I know for a fact that there wasn't as much profit attached to intellectual dishonesty. And then I think the last piece is the tribalism of politics. Again, the problem, historically, people have been divided over all kinds of things, but I'm not sure, it was usually, okay, we have a different view of these issues, and therefore we've divided ourselves. Now it's kind of, we've divided ourselves, and whatever my team says, I'm willing to go along with, which kind of, to my mind, puts the cart before the horse and makes any agreement, I keep coming back to the public policy stuff because that's what I do. So this combination, it's just a pernicious combination of being able to cater your message, being able to do it just for the sake of inflaming things, all grafted on top of a political environment that's highly tribal. And I think that in part explains where we are. Which of course gets us back to Shakespeare, which is, democracy's got some, it's got some potential flaws, which is you kind of go where the crowd goes, and many of us are uncomfortable with where the crowd, different parts of the crowd are going at present, here and around the world.
No, definitely. So going back to Shakespeare, I did mention at the beginning of this that the play is a tragedy. And one of the big tragedies of the play is the fact that Coriolanus, himself, even though he's adored by the populace, even though the Roman mobs are incredibly invested in this man, and they believe that he's just won this war against Volsci, I think, so they are literally going to storm the gates of Rome for Coriolanus in the play. But Coriolanus himself is definitely a patrician who has a lot of contempt for the plebeians. He says a lot of terrible things about them very early on in the play. I don't know what in current events could make the play more relevant to this, but how do we feel about the notion of demagogues taking advantage of these people?
Right, so this is timeless too. I mean, if you think about politicians, the image has always been catered, whether it's FDR not wanting to appear in the wheelchair, the way Kennedy portrayed himself. I mean, we've always paid great attention to our image, in part because of the way that it's going to be received. Now, each of the media that we've talked about amplifies and changes the way image is conveyed. So just as Kennedy may have thought very much about how he's going to appear on TV, I mean, Trump, for all the craziness of these tweets, does seem to have, there is kind of an ability to move people around that. So to the extent that democracy has always been about presenting some image to the masses, it's just another one of those kind of timeless themes. You're just doing it in a different kind of way. And you've got, again, even the politicians who are, I'm a man of the people, Lamar Alexander in his flannel shirt, that's also very calculated. Now, we don't know, to what extent those people actually like the people that they're interacting with, but I don't think that Coriolanus would be the first or the last to be a person of the masses who doesn't particularly like the masses. I mean, that's another one where you're kind of tapping into a theme that is quite durable.
Definitely. Well, with that, I think we can turn it to questions. Thank you, Professor Wheelan, for this talk. Would anyone like to? Yes.
You explained a part of the arc of how things have moved all the way from the Roman times up to the present time. Can you project forward, and if necessary, in a positive or negative sense, in terms of where you can see that arc going after this?
Boy, I'd be a much richer person if I could, right? I'd be a shareholder in whatever new technology. I can't, because I can tell you, you all can remember like the first time you saw one of these technologies. I remember the first time someone showed me a cell phone. I remember the first time someone told me Twitter, said, which I thought was the most asinine thing I'd ever. The cell phone I could kind of see was like, wow, that's cool. The Twitter, I'm like, that is insane. So I can't, because it's very hard to know what the next technological leap is. And there's that aphorism that any new technology is almost indistinguishable from magic. And that really has been true. I mean, the internet, if you told me back in 1988 that there was going to be a mechanism whereby I could sit at a computer, which we did have, and all of the knowledge that had ever been produced would be at my fingertips, that's science fiction, right? So, I mean, the cell phone is kind of science fiction in some way. At least with a telephone, there's a wire you can kind of get
Star Trek.
Yeah, right. You did Star Trek, right? So I can't. But, I mean, the reason we keep coming back to Shakespeare is the human emotions aren't going to change. The nature of democracy isn't going to change. The need to kind of persuade people is going to change. So I can't answer your question, which is what are the tools that we're going to be using? And if I were to predict, it would just be so foolish when I was wrong. You'd be like, you were the guy who, predicted the personal spaceship. Which everyone always predicts. Tom?
I'm going to bring it around to play a little bit, at the risk of boring everybody who hasn't read the play. But and I'm going to have a little sympathy for the devil. This guy, Coriolanus, who I don't know how many nasty terms he uses to refer to the people, and geese, hares, fragments. He just can't stop himself. But he's the only person, the only character in that play with any integrity. He's the only character in that play who does not try to manipulate. Well, he tries, but his integrity keeps him from becoming a manipulator of the people. Every other character in that play is manipulating the people by pretending to love them. He's honest. You're just all pieces of shit. And if I could pretend for 10 minutes to be your friend, just long enough to become consul, I'd shut you all down. So, is there a character like that who has the integrity to admit that he hates the people?
Yeah, I mean, sir, you've led me down a path. I mean, it is certainly true that supporters of the president will say he tells us the truth. He says what's on his mind, and I think he's somewhat inoculated against the crazy things he says because he's so brilliantly portrayed the media and the elites as the enemy.
So he has this illusion of integrity.
Yeah, it is yes. Yeah, speaking truth to the power, and the folks who disparage you don't want you to hear this, and so the more offensive it is.
That's a nice point.
Yeah, I mean that's the best I can come up with. But again, we haven't seen the play. You have, but it makes me respect even more this point. Which is really amazing.
You wouldn't get anywhere in American politics by having the integrity of outwardly and openly hating the public. That wouldn't work here. And it almost worked in the Roman Republic, and it certainly worked in Shakespeare's day all the time. So maybe it's a good thing about where we are, but it also means that it means that the success of what you've called together we've had it named as the illusion of integrity. That will be where the successful sweet spot always is.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point, right? The illusion of integrity, the illusion of being on the side of the masses. I don't know if that works in this case. Even, I don't know that if was FDR really a great, did he wade into the bleachers at the base? Probably not, right? So I think it's a really interesting point. Clinton, I think, really was, apparently his retail political skills were unmatched. And he did draw energy, like he really did love being part of that process. There's no doubt about that, Bill Clinton, whereas Hillary did not have that ability.
I've been reading Woodard's book.
Yes. Fear.
And I keep thinking about here that no time ever have we had a person had the ability to send a message to everybody in the world and read such a succinct, easy to understand message without filters, without controls. And that to me is scary. Going back to Coriolanus, I think there were people who were helping to sort of keep things down. I don't see that.
Yes, the question point is that there's been no time in history where one person can reach so many people unfiltered. Even back in the day when presidents spoke on primetime TV, you got to ask for the time, right? And the networks don't always give it to you, right? You've got to demonstrate that there is some compelling need. It's not just another political speech, and certainly if you've been involved in a political campaign, you're always trying to get the press there, right? Always doing something that's going to make it newsworthy. And there's no doubt that with Twitter, you don't need the camera crews to show up. There's no other party. Now, the part that I don't fully understand is somebody's got to be willing to listen. And what the president has managed to do is get millions and millions of people who are willing to accept those tweets and retweet them. And, there's nothing stopping me from walking in the middle of the green and screaming whatever I want, but most of you aren't going to pay a lot of attention. So the part of the puzzle I can't quite get my mind around is why there's the audience that there is. I guess being president is part of it. But
What's so interesting?
Remember that how many characters there are. I mean, it's short, it's sweet, it gets to the point. And Trump himself made the comment that when they changed the number, he could no longer be the Ernest Hemingway of tweets.
Right. One thing that brings up for me is I remember reading Julia Ioffe is this journalist who analyzes a lot of Russia, and she talked with Russian officials who were captivated by Kim Kardashian and how they were fascinated by the fact that they said this woman has 50 million followers and all she does is just tweet about her hair care products and everything, and like millions of people around the world just like adhere to her, like for no sake. If only we could harness that, if only we could just like tweet something out and people would care about us. And my insight just as a native user of Twitter is that for a long time before people realized what was happening, Trump was definitely still in the Kim Kardashian category of person where, oh, this is just entertainment. When we talk about the blending of entertainment media, like politics is in there too, is it not? So once you realize,
we're all being bombarded. So these people are doing something such that busy people getting messages and push notifications from every direction somehow say, these are the ones I want to subscribe to, these are the ones I want to listen to. And that is not about the technology. That is about the creativity of the message, right? They're doing something for good or for ill that is penetrating the rest of this complete noise. And that, in some ways, trumps the technology. Oh, God, that was not intended. That is more important at the end of the day than technology. Yes?
But what would you say to the idea that Trump is less a creature of Twitter than he is of reality TV?
I would agree with that. I mean, Twitter in some ways is a continuation. I mean, reality TV is about constructing some not reality, but that people want, that people want to watch, right? And some of those reality TVs died and some didn't. And it's all, this too, not to belabor the point, comes back to, all right, what human emotions am I going to tap into that people are going to watch? And there's clearly an art to that. And I don't think it's unrelated to the Twitter. So I don't see any, even though they're very different mediums, I don't see an enormous gulf. between that ability, which is, creating some kind of drama, tension, enemy. I mean, if you did watch The Apprentice, they're like good guys and bad guys. Part of reality TV is the editing that then creates something that's really just the standard fiction in terms of creating a narrative arc and everything else. But yeah, I think I would totally buy that premise, that they're really just part and parcel of the same thing.
When I first heard about cyber-analytica and all that stuff, I was terrified. Because now it wasn't just like you say the newspaper, that everything's out there and we're all judging it. It's actually being pinpointed to us. But then people started saying, oh no, we're really a long way from that actually working. Is it as scary as it sounds?
I find it as scary as it sounds. I mean, the big data piece that I alluded to earlier, people know a lot about you, right? So how many of you know the Target story about the data analytics, right? So Target wanted, what they found was that women who are pregnant, for reasons that I don't understand, I'm not sure they do, develop a very deep retail relationship where, if you shop somewhere when you're pregnant, you're going to keep shopping there. So let's just stipulate to that. So they wanted to identify pregnant women. What they realize is they have a bunch of pregnant shoppers who've registered for their baby registry. So there's some subset of women who've already said, look, I'm pregnant and this is what I'm due. And then the data analytics people said, well, let's watch what they buy. So baby wipes, some obvious things, but also vitamins. They moved to unscented lotions because of the sensitivity of smell and so on. And then presumably other people whose shopping habits change in the same way are probably pregnant too. So they come up with a pregnancy prediction index, and they mail those folks coupons and other things to get them into the store. And the punchline of this particular case, but it gets back to the scary piece, there's a New York Times Magazine piece on this, where there's some father in Minneapolis, and his daughter's in high school, and she's getting all these coupons for like baby wipes and cribs, and he's like, she needs to finish high school and go to college. Why are they putting all these ideas in your head about having a baby? And so he calls the Target store and berates the manager. And the manager, it's Minnesota, they're very friendly, he really feels bad. So he, looks into it, calls back a couple weeks later and says, I just want to apologize again. And the father says, well, actually, it's my turn to apologize. And the quote, I think, in the magazine article is, there have been some things going on here I wasn't aware of. But the punchline is, Target knew that his daughter was pregnant before he did. And that, by the way, is not a new story. So the answer is yes. When people cobble together your credit, all the public stuff, they know a lot about you. Increasingly, where you are because of your location and everything else. So, and that again is a neutral tool. It's a great thing if someone's recommending an album that you wouldn't otherwise know about and you're going to like, right? But it's pretty nefarious when it's used by Russian bots to influence elections.
So I wanted to just go back to one thing you said about the power of fear and just challenge you on that a little bit. So that is true, but at the same time, I think that the power of hope is also incredibly powerful emotion. And in fact, we've had several presidents who've been very successful, from FDR to Bill Clinton to Obama, and the image of Obama and the power of hope, right? So, and I also think there's a predisposition for certain voters towards hope and then negativity, depending on what your psychological orientation is. And so those things are very important. So there's a nuanced analysis that we should, I think, revisit over and over again. We're supposed to care about democracy and civil rights.
Yeah, there's no doubt that hope, and I think the Roosevelt, if you listen to those fireside chats, they're genius. They're not very long. The language is eloquent in its own way. So it's not to say that hope has no place. It's just, and I'm quoting one of my students' master's theses, it's just that fear really does activate another part of the brain. And whereas hope is a more, I'm going to get the biology wrong, but it's a more complex process. You're kind of thinking it through. Fear is that reptilian part. It's the survival part that tends to shut down others. And so if you activate fear, it's very hard for the rest of your process to work. And there's even data around that like you have trouble doing basic things if the fear part is activated. So it doesn't mean we should give up on hope. It just means that fear is an easier, faster way to go. I'll give you one other funky example, is that there's just the psychology of the stuff we're just starting to learn about, which is language is not neutral either. Like, we would like to think that, well, that's an issue, my views on immigration are shaped by the facts and the data, and I've done research. But what we know is, and Shakespeare knew this intuitively, is language isn't neutral at all. So, why do people who are opponents of a broader immigration policy, they don't talk about undocumented workers, they talk about illegal aliens. And undocumented workers says to me and to other people, well, undocumented, you haven't done your paperwork, we all hate paperwork, that's the bureaucrats. And workers is a very strong word in this society, so undocumented workers, great. Illegal aliens is you're breaking the law, you're from away, your intents are hostile. So we know, and certainly political operatives and others have done tremendous amounts of research around language that activates your brain in different ways. I mean, nobody talks about abortion, it's pro-choice, pro-life. The gambling industry isn't the gambling industry, they're the gaming industry. Because gaming's fun, gambling is what leaves you face down in the gutter, right? So, be aware of how language, which is Shakespeare's bread and butter, then activates emotion, and emotion is what activates action.
I've been disappointed in how the mainstream media, Times, Post, so forth, handled Trump's tweets and his fake news. And I'm wondering if you had any ideas as to a good way to do this. My own thought, off the top of my head, is to repeat them in a nice little line there, and then keep following up and saying, oh, this is a lie, questionable. Hey, he got one right.
Yeah, so the research is very bizarre on this, that repeating an untruth, even if you're trying to disabuse people of it, tends to reinforce the untruth. And it's true even in like the public health literature. So if I say, it's not true, and then some fallacy, for reasons I don't fully understand, but have been documented that, now what I think is true is whatever the original untruth was. So repeating things is just not a very good idea. And also, if you're an aspiring politician, you should never repeat a charge, I am not a crook, that was a bad, not Nixon's finest moment, for all kinds of reasons, but don't, so I don't know. I mean, you can't, I guess you should ignore things that have no news value, but then, he is president of the United States, and when the president says something, it tends to have news, and if it's outlandish, that's news too. So if you start to ignore things of substance, however crazy that a leader is saying, then that, you are now drifting into territory that's far from objective news gathering. So I don't know how you handle these things. And again, repeating the mistruths and things that are objectively untrue, I'm not sure that's persuading people who were persuaded by the original statements. I mean, that comes back to this difficulty, which is, a certain proportion of people are persuaded emotionally that something must be true for some of the things that Tom said, which is, oh, he's giving it to us straight because I don't trust all these other elite sources and so on. And that's a difficult situation to be in. So I don't know what I would tell the New York Times or the Post about some of these things.
I think we have time for one more question.
What is the role of young people in shaping and using these forms of media? We're the ones who've grown up with them and understand them.
Oh, that's a great finishing question, and I want Matt to answer it as well. So the question was, what's the role of young people? You are going to have to make the rules, right? You are the ones who understand the power and weaknesses of these various media more than, the first year students understand it more than Matt, and he understands it, more than my kids. And like we're each at a different point. You're going to, as the primary users, you're going to have to figure out what the rules are, and that's true with social norms and raising children and screen time and things that are not government policy. And then it's going to be true in the private sector with Facebook and Twitter, that are private entities, not subject to the First Amendment, but still have enormous public obligations. And then obviously it's going to be true in the government realm, which is, okay, what do we do about things that are demonstrably not true? How does that conflict with our First Amendment? So you will have to be the ones who make these policies, just as generations ago had to deal with automobile safety, or pornography and print media. Every new innovation brings with it its own challenges, and you're going to have to be the ones who wrestle with that. But you got to answer that one as well.
Okay, definitely. I think that just in our generation, we can talk a lot about changing, the culture of Twitter or the platform that you use on, the reasons why you're using Snapchat and this, that, or the other. But I think that the bigger issues that we can tackle is the mental health and usage around social media, and then also the level of engagement that we have in it with it. So when the digital literacy of it, basically. So when you know, for instance, that Facebook's algorithm is trying to have you on Facebook for 8 hours a day, we as a society and a collective, and Apple just has this whole new thing where you can limit how much social media that you use per day and whatnot. But we need to just keep promoting things like that and keep really contextualizing how we want to use these tools, because they are tools. They're tools that have profit motives behind them. But I think that we really need to understand what the motivations are behind YouTube, because if this is how we're going to get our media, for instance, why we're on these platforms, what we're using them for. And then on another note, in terms of just digital literacy, I know that with a lot of my older family members and whatnot, they will come to me with stories where they're just did you hear about this, whatnot? And I just discovered that one thing that my uncle was this Facebook page my uncle was obsessed with for the longest time, Blacktivist, turned out to be a Russian bot page that I was just I need you to and I was just these stories don't make any sense. So we as the people who are going to be dealing with doctored images and fake tweets and just are going to be able to understand a little bit more what is going on in this information and just the culture of these sites, I think we're going to have to really step up the game in terms of teaching ourselves, policing ourselves, and teaching our future children.
So actually, I'll finish with a plug for Dartmouth. One of the things we're rediscovering is the importance of a liberal arts education, which is, do you have a basic understanding of logic, of history, right, of economics? Because that, at the end of the day, is the most powerful tool for discerning fact from fiction, those who have legitimate interests versus those who are more nefarious.
But it's so expensive.
I think that's another talk. Thank you for coming.